I came back to Camp Stellaris because my sister asked me to. Not directly, she'd been dead for 3 years. But 2 weeks after I lost my job at the marketing firm, her husband Eric called and said he was finally ready to clear out her things from the camp. He asked if I wanted anything before he donated it all. I said yes before I really thought about what that meant. Stellaris had been Maya's project. She'd worked there for 6 summers during college, first as a counselor and then as the assistant director. When the camp shut down in 2019 due to funding issues, she'd talked about buying the property someday, turning it into an artist's retreat or a dark sky preserve. She'd loved the place in a way I never quite understood. To me, it had just been the camp where my sister spent her summers. The reason she was never home during the months when the rest of us took family vacations. The camp sat on 200 acres in the Adirondacks, about 40 minutes from the nearest town. The property had been donated to the astronomy education nonprofit back in the 70s by some wealthy family whose name I couldn't remember. There were 8 cabins arranged in a circle around a central lodge, an observatory with a 12-inch refractor telescope, a small amphitheater, and a boathouse down by the lake. Maya had shown me pictures. I'd visited once, briefly, to pick her up at the end of a summer when our parents couldn't make the drive. I remembered thinking it looked beautiful and isolated in equal measure. Maya used to say, "Never waste a clear night." She meant it about stargazing, about making the most of good weather for observation. I never understood why she said it with such intensity until now. Eric met me at the gate on a Thursday morning in late May. The camp had been empty for 5 years, and it showed. The gravel road leading in was overgrown with weeds. Several of the cabin shutters hung crooked. The observatory dome had a visible crack running across its surface. "Thanks for coming," Eric said. He looked tired. He'd remarried 6 months ago, and I got the sense his new wife wasn't thrilled about him holding on to Maya's things this long. "Most of her stuff is in cabin 4. That's where the counselors stayed. I already grabbed her books and some personal items, but there are boxes of camp materials, old star charts, that kind of thing. I figured you'd know better than me what's worth keeping." "Sure," I said. We walked through the property together. The main lodge was larger than I remembered. A 2-story structure with a stone fireplace and floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake. Inside, everything was dusty and still. There were tables and chairs stacked against the walls, a bulletin board with faded announcements, a bookshelf full of astronomy guides and field manuals. Eric led me to cabin 4. It was one of the smaller structures, just a single room with 4 bunk beds and a wood stove. Maya's things were in 2 large plastic bins pushed against the far wall. On top of one bin was a framed photograph of her standing in front of the observatory, grinning, pointing at the dome behind her. I picked up the photo. She looked young. Happy. The version of her I remembered before the accident. "Take your time," Eric said. "I need to check the main water shutoff before I go. I'll be in the lodge if you need me." He left. I sat down on one of the bunks and opened the first bin. Inside were the kinds of things you'd expect. Boxes of slides for planetarium presentations, stacks of constellation maps, a few worn-out camp t-shirts, a clipboard with schedules from the final summer, 2019. I pulled out the schedules and flipped through them. Each day was broken into blocks: morning hikes, telescope maintenance, lectures, night observation sessions. At the bottom of the first bin, I found a journal. It was a standard composition notebook with a marbled black and white cover. Maya's handwriting on the first page, summer 2019, observation log. I opened it and started reading. The entries were straightforward at first. Notes about which constellations were visible, which planets were in good viewing position, weather conditions. She'd sketched a few diagrams of telescope alignments. But as I flipped further into the journal, the entries started to change. July 18, 2019. Kids reported seeing lights moving over the lake last night during the meteor shower. I told them it was probably satellites, but the movement pattern was wrong. Too erratic. Too fast. July 23, 2019. Checked the observatory logs from last week. Someone's been using the telescope after hours. No sign-in sheets, no names. Asked the other counselors. No one admits to it. August 2nd, 2019. The lights are back. 3 of them this time, moving in formation. I watched for 20 minutes. They weren't planes. They weren't satellites. I don't know what they were. August 8th, 2019. Found the night observation deck covered in frost this morning. It's August. It was 65 degrees last night. No frost anywhere else on the property. August 14th, 2019. Something's wrong with the telescope. The alignment keeps drifting. I recalibrated, and an hour later it's pointing somewhere else. Always the same direction. North-northeast, about 40 degrees elevation. I stopped reading and looked up. Through the cabin window, I could see the observatory dome rising above the trees. The crack across its surface caught the morning light. I kept reading. August 19, 2019. The camp director told me to stop logging the lights. He said parents were getting nervous about the UFO talk, and it was bad for enrollment. I told him I was just documenting what we saw. He said to document approved celestial phenomena only. August 22, 2019. Last night of camp. The kids are gone. Most of the staff left this morning. I stayed to help with shutdown. I'm sitting in the observatory now. It's 11 p.m. The telescope is pointing north-northeast again. I didn't touch it. The next page was blank. Then, on the following page, there was a single line in Maya's handwriting, pressed hard into the paper like she'd been writing urgently. It's not watching the sky. The sky is watching back. That was the last entry. I closed the journal and sat there for a long time. Maya had died 3 months after that final summer. Car accident on a rural highway late at night. Single vehicle collision. The police said she'd swerved off the road for no apparent reason. No alcohol, no drugs, no mechanical failure. Just a sudden swerve into a tree. I heard footsteps outside. Eric appeared in the doorway. "Find anything you want?" he asked. I held up the journal. "Can I take this?" "Of course. That's why you're here." He glanced around the cabin. "Listen, I hate to ask, but would you mind staying here for a few days to help sort through everything? My wife and I are leaving for a trip tomorrow, and I'd really like to get this done before we go." "There's more stuff in the lodge and the observatory. I can pay you for your time." I thought about my empty apartment back in the city. I thought about the job applications I wasn't sending. I thought about Maya standing in front of the observatory, pointing at the dome, smiling. "Yeah," I said, "I can stay." Eric left that afternoon. He gave me the keys to the lodge and the observatory, showed me how to turn on the generator for electricity, and told me to call if I needed anything. Then he drove away, and I was alone. The first thing I did was walk the property. The camp felt different without Eric there. Quieter. The cabin stood empty and dark. The amphitheater benches were weathered and cracked. The boathouse door hung open, creaking slightly in the breeze. I ended up at the observatory. It was a small building, maybe 20 feet in diameter, with the dome mounted on top. The entrance was a heavy wooden door with a padlock. I used the key Eric had given me and stepped inside. The interior was circular, with a narrow staircase leading up to the observation deck. The walls were lined with shelves holding old star charts, equipment manuals, and logbooks. I climbed the stairs. The observation deck was a circular platform beneath the dome. In the center stood the telescope, a long white tube mounted on a heavy equatorial base. The dome's shutter was closed, but even in the dim light, I could see the telescope was pointed at an angle. North-northeast. About 40 degrees elevation. I walked around it slowly. The telescope looked old, that well-maintained. There was a control panel on the side with manual adjustment knobs for right ascension and declination. I didn't touch anything. On a small desk beside the telescope was a stack of observation logbooks. I picked up the top one and opened it. The entries were dated from the final summer, 2019. Different handwriting, different observers. Most entries were brief. Observed Jupiter and 4 moons. Clear skies. Lunar observation session with campers. Good visibility. But interspersed among the routine entries were others that stood out. June 30th, 2019. Unidentified light source observed at 23:30:47. Stationary for approximately 4 minutes before moving rapidly northwest. No sound. July 15th, 2019. Telescope alignment incorrect again. Corrected to proper coordinates, but drift continues. The final entry was dated August 22nd, 2019. The handwriting was Maya's. Final observation of the summer. Telescope continues to drift toward same coordinates despite repeated corrections. I'm leaving it pointed where it wants to point. Maybe that's what it's supposed to show us. Below that, she'd written a set of coordinates. I looked up at the closed dome shutter. I looked at the telescope. I thought about Maya's journal entry. The sky is watching back. I left the observatory and went back to the lodge as the sun started to set. That evening, I found something in the lodge I hadn't noticed before. Above the stone fireplace was a large photograph, faded and water-stained, showing the camp's original construction in 1974. A group of men and women stood in front of the half-built observatory, smiling for the camera. But what caught my attention was the orientation. Even in the photograph, I could see that the observatory wasn't positioned randomly. It was set at a precise angle, the dome facing a specific direction, north-northeast. I looked closer at the photograph. In the corner, barely visible, was a handwritten caption. Breaking ground on the observation station. May the vigil continue. Not observatory. Observation station. I went back to the second bin in cabin 4 and started digging deeper. At the very bottom, beneath old camp t-shirts and teaching materials, I found a manila folder with brittle yellowed papers inside. The first document was a deed transfer from 1974. The Carver family had donated the land to the Astronomy nonprofit with one condition. The observatory structure must maintain its original orientation and primary function as established by previous site use. Previous site use. The camp had been built on land that had some prior purpose. I kept reading. There was a surveyor's map from 1972 showing the property layout before construction. The map showed a single existing structure on the land where the observatory now stood. The structure was labeled simply Tower, 1891. There had been something here before the camp. A tower built in 1891, positioned at the exact same spot and orientation as the current observatory. I pulled out my phone and searched for information about the Carver family and the Adirondacks. I found a brief mention in a Historical Society archive about Cyrus Carver, an astronomer and industrialist who'd built a private observation tower in upstate New York in the late 1800s. The article said he'd become obsessed with monitoring a specific region of the northern sky, and had spent the last years of his life alone at the tower before it was abandoned following his death in 1923. The tower had been demolished in 1974, the same year the camp was built. But the camp's observatory had been built in exactly the same location, pointing in exactly the same direction. I sat on the bunk in cabin 4 with all the papers spread around me, trying to understand what this meant. The observatory hadn't been built to study the stars randomly. It had been built to continue watching something specific, something that Cyrus Carver had been watching since 1891, and Maya had discovered what it was. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the bunk, listening to the sounds of the forest, wind in the trees, distant water lapping at the shore, small animals moving through the underbrush. Around midnight, I heard something else. It was a mechanical sound, faint and rhythmic, a whirring like a motor running. It was coming from the direction of the observatory. I got up and looked out the cabin window. The observatory dome was visible above the trees, silhouetted against the night sky. As I watched, the dome began to rotate slowly. The shutter was opening. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched the controls. I grabbed my flashlight and walked across the property to the observatory. The door was still locked. I unlocked it and went inside. The whirring sound was louder now. I climbed the stairs to the observation deck. The dome shutter was fully open and the telescope was moving. The motorized mount was adjusting the position, tracking something across the sky. I looked at the control panel. It was off. The switches were in the neutral position. The telescope shouldn't have been moving, but it was. I followed its line of sight. The telescope was pointed at a patch of sky between Ursa Major and Draco. I couldn't see anything unusual there with my naked eye. Just stars. Then I noticed something. One of the stars was different, brighter, and it wasn't twinkling like the others. I watched for several minutes. The light didn't move. It just hung there, motionless, directly in line with where the telescope was pointing. I looked through the eyepiece. The light resolved into something I couldn't quite process. It wasn't a star. It wasn't a planet. It was a point of light, but the light seemed to have depth, like I was looking into something rather than at something. And at the center of it, barely visible, was a shape. Something curved and vast. I stepped back from the telescope. My hands were shaking. The whirring sound stopped. The telescope stopped moving. The dome shutter began to close. I stood there in the dark, breathing hard, trying to understand what I'd just seen. When I finally went back to the cabin, it was past 2 in the morning. I didn't sleep. I sat on the bunk with Maya's journal open in my lap, reading and rereading her entries. The sky is watching back. In the morning, I went back through the cabins more carefully. I'd been so focused on Maya's things and the observatory that I hadn't paid attention to the rest of the property. That's when I noticed something strange about the cabin windows. Every cabin had 2 windows, one on each side, but they weren't positioned for optimal light or view. They were positioned at specific angles. I walked from cabin to cabin, checking each one. All 16 windows faced the same direction, north-northeast. I went to the lodge. Same thing. The floor-to-ceiling windows didn't just face the lake for aesthetics. They faced north-northeast. The amphitheater, the boathouse, even the small maintenance shed. Every structure on the property had at least one window or opening oriented toward the same point in the sky. The camp hadn't just been built around an observatory. It had been built as an observation station. The entire property was designed to watch one specific part of the sky. I found more evidence in the lodge basement. There were old architectural plans rolled up in a storage tube. I spread them out on a dusty table. The plans showed the camp layout from 1974, annotated with precise measurements and angles. At the bottom of the page was a note in small, careful handwriting. All structures oriented to maintain sightline to primary coordinates. Observatory serves as central observation point. Secondary viewing angles calculated for maximum coverage. This wasn't a summer camp that happened to have an observatory. This was an observation station disguised as a summer camp, and Maya had figured it out. I went back to cabin 4 and pulled out her final notebook, the one with the scattered fragmentary entries. I read through it again, more carefully this time. The telescope doesn't just observe, it connects. The camp was built here for a reason. The orientation of the observatory isn't random. She'd known. She'd understood that the entire camp was purpose-built to watch something in the sky. But she'd made a mistake. She'd looked too closely. She'd established a connection that couldn't be broken. That evening, I made a decision. I was going to use the telescope one more time. I needed to see what Maya had seen. I needed to understand. I waited until dark. Then I walked to the observatory, unlocked the door, and climbed to the observation deck. This time I turned on the control panel. The motors hummed to life. I opened the dome shutter manually and adjusted the telescope to point at Maya's coordinates. The sky was clear. There was no moon. The stars were brilliant. I looked through the eyepiece. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just stars, crisp and bright against the blackness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I started to notice the light. The same one from the night before, brighter now, pulsing very slightly. I adjusted the focus. The star resolved into that same point of light with depth, the darkness at its center. I kept watching. Slowly, impossibly, the shape at the center became clearer. It wasn't a darkness. It was an opening, a gap in the light. And beyond the gap, I could see something moving. It was massive. I had no sense of scale, no way to judge distance, but the shape seemed to extend far beyond the frame of the telescope's view. It was curved, organic, like looking at the edge of something enormous passing in front of a distant light source, and then it turned. I don't know how else to describe it. The shape shifted orientation, and suddenly I was looking at what might have been a surface, or a hole, or something else entirely. There were structures on it, geometric patterns that caught the light in ways that made my eyes hurt. And then I saw the eye. It wasn't an eye in any biological sense. It was a point of absolute darkness, perfectly circular, that seemed to dilate as I watched. And I felt with a certainty I can't explain, that it was looking back at me. Not at the Earth, not at the camp, at me specifically, through the telescope, through the connection. I jerked away from the eyepiece. My heart was hammering, and then I felt it. The dual perspective. I was standing in the observatory looking up, and simultaneously I was up there looking down at myself. Two views at once, observer and observed, collapsed into a single moment. I could see the observatory dome from above. I could see the lake. I could see the cabins arranged in their circle. All their windows pointed upward toward the same spot in the sky. And I understood. The camp wasn't built to study the sky. It was built to be seen from it. Every window, every angle, every structure was positioned to be visible from that one specific point. The camp was a marker, a signal, a way of saying, "We know you're there. We're watching you, watch us." Cyrus Carver had known. He'd built his tower in 1891 to watch it. And when he died, the Carver family had made sure the watching continued. They'd donated the land with the condition that the orientation be maintained. They'd disguised it as a summer camp, filled it with children and telescopes and innocent astronomical observation. But the real purpose had never changed. Keep watching. Keep the connection open. Never waste a clear night. I staggered back from the telescope. The dual perspective vanished. I was just myself again, alone in the observatory, breathing hard. But the connection was still there. I could feel it, a thin thread linking me to whatever was in the sky above. I shut down the observatory. I closed the dome shutter and locked it. I took Maya's journals and notebooks and all the documents I'd found and put them in my car. Then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I went back to the basement of the lodge and found the old architectural plans. I took photographs of every page, the measurements, the angles, the note about sight lines and coverage. I needed evidence. I needed proof that this place was more than it appeared to be. I left the camp the next morning. I called Eric from the road and told him I'd finished. I didn't mention what I'd found. What could I say? That his dead wife had discovered a multi-generational observation project disguised as a summer camp? That something in the sky had been watching this property since at least 1891? That Maya had made contact with it and couldn't escape? I drove home and tried to return to normal life. I applied for jobs. I met with friends. I did all the ordinary things you're supposed to do. But I couldn't stop thinking about the camp, about the telescope, about the shape in the sky with its impossible eye, watching. 3 weeks after I left Stellaris, I was driving home from a late dinner with a friend. It was around 11:30, rural highway, no other cars. The night was clear. Never waste a clear night. Maya's voice in my head. Her rule, her obsession. I looked up through the windshield at the stars, and I saw it. The light. The same bright point, in the same position relative to the constellations I'd memorized from Maya's charts. It was there, above me, watching. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. I stood there looking up at it, my heart pounding. The light didn't move. It just hung there, steady and bright. And I felt the connection. The same dual perspective I'd experienced through the telescope. I was standing on the road looking up, and simultaneously I was up there looking down at myself. Observer and observed. Linked. I got back in my car and drove home. I didn't look up again. But I know it's still there. Every clear night in the same position, watching. And I know now why Maya swerved off that road. I know what she saw when she looked up. She saw the same thing I'm seeing now. The connection she made that final summer at Camp Stellaris never closed. It followed her home. It followed her to that highway. She'd looked up at a clear night sky, just like she'd always done. Never waste a clear night. And she'd seen it watching her from above. And in that moment of recognition, the dual perspective must have overwhelmed her. She was in the car, and she was above the car at the same time. She couldn't tell which view was real, which perspective was hers. She swerved because she wasn't sure which way was down anymore. And now it's following me. I still have her journals. I still have the architectural plans with their careful notations about sightlines and coverage. I still have the photograph of the original tower from 1891. The camp is scheduled for demolition next month. Eric finally found a buyer for the land, someone who wants to build private vacation homes on the lakefront. The observatory will be torn down. The cabins will be removed. The windows that all point toward the same coordinates will be shattered and hauled away. Maybe that will break the connection. Maybe when the camp is gone, the observation station will finally go dark after more than a century of continuous watching. But I don't think so. Because 2 days ago I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a surveyor's map, my apartment building, my address, and a small notation in the margin. Primary window orientation, north-northeast, 40 degrees elevation. My bedroom window. The one I look out every night. It faces the same direction as every window at Camp Stellaris. I don't know when it was built this way. I don't know if it was intentional or coincidence. But I know what it means. The observation isn't limited to the camp. The camp was just one station, one point in a network that's been growing since 1891. Maybe longer. How many buildings have windows pointed toward those specific coordinates? How many people have looked up at a clear night sky and felt something looking back? How many of them established the connection without ever knowing what they'd done? I haven't been sleeping well lately. When I do sleep, I dream about standing in the observatory with Maya beside me, both of us looking through the telescope at the same time, seeing the same impossible shape in the sky. In the dreams, she turns to me and says, "Never waste a clear night. That's what it wants. For us to keep watching, to keep the connection alive." I wake up and check the sky through my bedroom window. The light is always there, in the same position. Last night, the light moved for the first time, not across the sky, toward my window. It's lower now, closer. The dual perspective is getting stronger. Sometimes I can't tell if I'm in my apartment or above it. Sometimes I look down at my hands and I'm not sure they're mine. The camp is being demolished in 2 weeks. I received a final notice from Eric yesterday, asking if I wanted to visit the property one last time before the work begins. I haven't decided yet if I'll go, but I know that if I do, I'll walk to the observatory one last time. I'll climb the stairs to the observation deck, and I'll look through the telescope, just to confirm what I already know. It's still there. It's always been there. And it's still watching. The sky is watching back.